So my name is Cindy Williams. I started in emergency services in 1983, police department. In 1990, switched to EMS. I started actually as a dispatcher while I finished off my EMT cert, and then in 92 became a paramedic. So we're looking at 33 years wearing a blue uniform. I first heard of post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder in 1986, January actually, 1986. I was in the police academy, and they spent 40 hours going over violent crimes, sexual assault against children and women, because all my instructors were police officers, retired police officers from Oakland PD, San Francisco, San Jose PD. These were hardcore John Wayne police officers. They had an on-site therapist that came and talked about post-traumatic stress and the effects that it would have on us in law enforcement. The thing is, she was a PhD, a wonderful, wonderful therapist, and we remain friends. It's not about her, but she was a civilian that went through a normal scholastic educational process to get her PhD in psychotherapy analysis. Now, she was never a police officer. That's the most important thing. She was never a firefighter or a paramedic. She was a civilian, even though she hung out with cops, and helped taught the police academy. She said inevitably somebody in each class would come up to her and talk to her about a call they had or an event or a child molest case, or they themselves were molested. But she was never a cop. She's never been in our position. So as a new person, you kind of can't help it, but you accept this information and dismiss it, right? Because unless you pull the combat boots on and sit in a patrol car or a fire engine or an ambulance seat, you can't possibly grasp what we do. You learned how to put on extra suits of armor, and whatever it took to get to the next shift. You just kind of sucked it up, and that's just the way it was. My personal first-hand experience with it was a horrible, horrible child rape molest case. And I still remember the person who was arrested and put 26 years in prison. And I remember the little girl's name, and I remember it just as it was yesterday. It was a very violent, horrific situation, and it was just two police officers on duty after midnight. The guy blew a stop sign, and that was the probable cause to pull him over. And I was put in charge of the young girl in the front seat who was covered in blood. And in the 80s, the ambulance company, there was none. It was all volunteer Red Cross. And after 20 minutes waiting for the ambulance to be staffed by volunteers, it never showed up. And I knew she was bleeding to death, so I wrapped her in a blanket. And I drove her code 3 in my patrol car to the hospital. And I will never forget her putting her arm around my neck and saying, "Please don't leave me." That's when I knew that law enforcement wasn't for me. I got to stay by her side until she was rushed into emergency surgery. As soon as I could, I got my post certificates, which you only get from the state of California after 1 year completed service, full-time work. I left and went back to parking, and I immediately took in first responder course, and it just clicked. It made sense to me. And then I took an EMT course, and then I took a 50% cut in pay and got hired with the local ambulance company. What I didn't realize is that started what I call the file cabinet of hell. The first file. The file cabinet of hell is my interpretation of what we do. And over the years, our brain safely takes a traumatic call and it puts it in a file and opens up a drawer and it stuffs it in there and it closes it. And that's what I did. And whether it's one call or a million calls, your file cabinet, the longer you're in this business, eventually fills up. And I didn't identify it in 1988. And I didn't identify it in 1992 when I started this job. I had already put into place a very negative way of handling horrific calls, and I didn't even know it, just the way it is. And you develop dark humor. That's how we coped, dark humor. So to answer your question, I knew I was going to see horrible things. Did I have a plan? I thought I had a plan. I really did. I think everybody that sits in a new hire academy in anything goes, I got this, I got a plan. You know, you really do think that. And it kind of gives you a false sense of security. But looking back, you don't have a plan. You're stupid. How could you possibly? Unless you've lived through it. Unless you've talked with someone and actually truly listened. You really don't. I just knew that how I handled it at the police department was to put it in the file cabinet of hell. Joke it off. Black humor, you know. I know not to eat, you know, shitty foods, drink alcohol, beat my significant other. I'm going to say that multiple times because that's what we're paraphrased and trained to say. And I thought I had, but I hadn't. And for the most part, some of it, yes, I did have a plan. After a bad call, I would do a mental checklist. And any new employee, any new paramedic or cop, you sit there and you go, I'm actually cool. That didn't bother me. I don't know why my partner's over there in the corner sucking her thumb crying to her mama, but I'm cool. And what that is your own safety mechanism, putting it in the file, opening up the drawer, shoving it in the back of the file cabinet of hell. So, yeah, my plan was just to shove it away and take, you know, care not to drink, do drugs, or beat up significant others. Seriously, that's what it was. That was my plan. This is the thing I really want to get across to my peers and anybody else who's really paying attention. In some cases that you've identified, it is a significant call. It's one call. It's not just one call. It becomes an accumulation of post-traumatic stress. I could sit here and conjure up call after call after call, and your audience would be exhausted. To answer your question, when I first knew that it really affected me was I was working Santa Clara County with my dear partner, Marcy. Marcy and I had 10 pediatric codes in 3 months. And something, I think, clicked in our head negatively. And when we got back from the 10th pediatric call, I don't think we were acting appropriately, and our peers, which is important, recognized in us that we were walking around in circles, we really just weren't making sense, and it's because our file cabinet of hell had just tipped over. And they called the on-site back then, the ambulance company, had an on-site therapist who came and defused us. The important thing was that on-site therapist, even though he was a trained professional, he'd never worked in the ambulance. So he didn't know what it was like to have 10 pediatric codes, 2 of which were twins. I used to keep a journal. My first year as a paramedic, I had 33 full arrests in 1 year's time. They called me the debutante of death. 33 codes. I got really good at putting that suit of armor on, blocking my emotions away from everything. You become emotionally numb. And it's not that you get insensitive. It's just you've learned how to protect yourself. So, of course, I remember the first time I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and the second time. And I think the third time was the most horrific, was the house fire, where there were 6 handicapped teenagers that were trapped in their beds. And the caretakers ran out with a fully involved house, and they all burnt, and they were all different stages of burn. And what made that most horrific to me wasn't so much the 6 burnt children, which is bad enough, because I know you've had people that talked about horrible children calls. It was the failing of the system. And what are we all trained to do when you report on scene of any kind of significant call? Is you report to the incident commander. Well, he wasn't there. So I had dispatch contact our supervisor, but he was in a place where his cell phone wasn't working. and his radio wasn't working, so he never got the call. So I was completely, utterly alone at the command post with my partner. We didn't have the tarps to lay out for the bodies as they were coming out. And we were right next to a hotel, so everyone in the hotel had come out to watch, and it was raining. And I had to figure out where to triage these bodies. And some of them were still alive, and some of them were in processes of dying. So, you just MacGyver it. And I used the back of my ambulance to block the view from the looky-loos to triage them. I was on scene by myself for 20 minutes. And I would rather have my skin peeled off one layer at a time. Then go through that again. I was so angry. And the interesting thing is, the day afterwards, I didn't get one phone call from the company I worked for. Nobody called to see how I was. There was no therapist. And I turned a corner because of that call, because of that anger. And I realized that the only person that was going to help me was myself. And my close friends, Nancy, my peers, the people that ran the call with me on the ambulances, those firefighters that took the time to check in with me. I put myself into therapy with EAP, Employee Assistance Program, but again, I was helped but by someone who didn't understand what the word code means, or third-degree burns, or what that smells like. For the next year, I couldn't eat barbecued food. And what happens is you come back from a call like that, and then all the other calls that are in your file cabinet of hell come out. And I have a handicap. It's just the way to put it. I wish it was a limp, or a missing limb, but my handicap is not visible to the average Joe. I don't have special parking, right? When I walk down the street, people, the average Joe, the civilians, have the assumption that I'm normal because I can walk, I don't have a limp, I don't have a white cane that shows I'm blind, I don't have a heart condition per se, I have an emotional condition, but it is equally debilitating. All that became evident to me when I was slowly dying, basically, because of this job. And I guess I could have gone out on a stress injury and be permanently retired out, which would have been fine. And I had every right to do it. And I had the therapists to back me up. But I wasn't ready to leave the field. As crazy as that sounds, I wasn't ready to leave. And I didn't have an exit plan. So I put in motion to take care of myself physically. Eating correctly. Exercising, working out, talking to my peers, because I have found since 2011 that talking to my peers is far more beneficial than, I hate to say it, than a paid therapist at this juncture, because they can empathize more than anything else, and that to me has a value. If you are approached by your peer or anybody, family member, someone who really sincerely cares about you, they're not just curious, and say, hey, I see a red flag. Tell me about this call, or maybe that call bothered you. Be open. That's the key. I want to make an impression upon people that are getting into emergency services, police, fire, ambulance, and dispatchers. We always forget about the poor dispatcher that has to listen on the other side of that phone to all the horrors that go on. And I know they feel helpless, but they're not. They're extremely helpful. Then when you get into this business, your life will change. It's just the way it is. It's a love-hate relationship. So please have some form of way to care for yourself first. Take care of yourself emotionally, mentally, and physically. Because you cannot take care of your significant others or your children or your patients or your career unless you take care of yourself first. Meaning, eat correctly, exercise, even if it's just to walk down to the post office and back. Be mindful of everything that goes on in your head emotionally and physically, and have an exit plan. Just recognize, I don't want to be like Cindy Williams, 26 years down the road, 26 pediatric deaths and hundreds and hundreds of codes and anger issues. And I don't want to be like her, right? I want to be a computer analyst or a doctor or a mathematician or do something else. Have a plan. Don't be my age and have issues and an emotional limp for the rest of your life. Have a plan. And I think when you have a plan, an exit strategy, I think it keeps your mind in the right place, because people that make EMS their career, I can't speak for police, fire, and ambulance, or police and fire, but when you make this your career like I did, you put all your eggs in one basket. Then when it's gone, you're left with identity issues. Who am I? What are my passions? And people always ask, if it's such a horrible job, why did you do it all these years? And I said, it's a love-hate relationship, because there is no job else out there in this whole entire world where you have the intimacy that we get in the back of the ambulance. My advice is listen to your peers when they turn on the lights in your foggy little house and say, hey, I think that call bothered you. Have an exit plan and be open. Be open to talking to somebody else, preferably somebody who's been in your shoes.